my feel-good breakfast show.
Welcome back. This is your Feel Good Breakfast Show. Thank you very much for tuning in as we begin this morning on the 1st of December, which is World AIDS Day, which means it's a time for us to reflect on how far we've come in our fight against HIV and AIDS. Now, a few months ago, we featured a groundbreaking study on the prevention of HIV and AIDS, which showed the remarkable effectiveness of antiretroviral drugs on transmission of the virus. Now, the World Health Organization has released their new treatment guidelines for people with HIV based on a part of that study. And with us on the line to give us the details on is one of the authors of the study, Professor Leigh-Anne, Director of the Clinical HIV Research Unit at the University of the Witwatersrand. Professor, thank you very much for taking our call this morning.
Thank you very much for your interest.
Now, your groundbreaking study was the first randomized clinical trial to show that treating HIV-infected individuals with antiretroviral therapy early on in their HIV infection reduces the risk of transmission of HIV to their uninfected partners. But just how effective were the drugs in preventing this infection?
So it was a randomized study in what we term discordant couples, where one partner is positive and the other negative.
Mm-hmm.
The study showed in the initial results in 2011 that there was a 96% reduction in HIV transmission. All the participants in the control arm were then offered antiretroviral therapy, and in fact all took it up. 98% took it up. Mm-hmm. And the 5-year results showed a 92% reduction in HIV transmission. There seems to be a gap in the first 6 weeks of treatment that there is still a risk of HIV transmission. And so there's been more focus and attention paid to using other methods of prevention during the first 6 weeks of antiretroviral therapy. Mm-hmm. So the results are very convincing, together with the SMART results, which shows that interrupting treatment is very dangerous to patients, mm-hmm. and together with another big study called the START study, which showed in patients who take antiretroviral therapy above CD4 count 500, that in fact there was a 58% reduction in opportunistic infections, cancer, and TB. Mm-hmm. And so those three studies together have driven the WHO to make the recommendations that all patients living with HIV should take antiretroviral therapy.
Indeed. Now, the new World Health Organization guidelines suggest that all people living with HIV should receive ARVs regardless of their CD4 count. Do you have any idea as to why they've taken this stance and how this differs from the current status quo of government policy?
Yeah, so the South African government policy currently sits at CD4 count 500, which is already relatively progressive. A number of countries in the world are still providing treatment only at CD4 count less than 350. The WHO has taken the stance because it's clear that HIV treatment prevents HIV transmission, and it is good for the person who has HIV to take the treatment. Mm-hmm. So all roads point towards the fact that everybody should be on antiretroviral therapy.
Yeah. Now, of course, we don't want to be sending the wrong message out there to those partners who have HIV, although ARVs do reduce the chances of transmission, like you've said. But should couples still, those who are on ARVs, still take the necessary protection steps and, obviously to prevent the spread of HIV from one partner to another? And what are those precautions? I think, you can't rehash these things enough.
So I think that there are other diseases than HIV that are transmitted sexually. There's certainly sexual infections like syphilis, gonorrhea, etc., which people are very aware of, but also hepatitis. Hepatitis B is transmitted sexually, and often the hepatitis B and HIV go hand in hand. The precaution that should be taken is to condomize. And at the moment, we are still working on other preventative methods for women. But in principle, condoms are the most important preventative method. And then in development, and I think also shown to be successful for men who have sex with men, is the concept of taking antiretroviral therapy ahead of HIV infection, so-called PrEP, pre-exposure prophylaxis. That is registered in South Africa and for the use in men who have sex with men, and should in fact be available. We are looking and still trying to work out how this pre-treatment prophylaxis could in fact be useful for young women and women in general. And those studies are still underway. They're probably moving towards implementation studies in high-risk populations.
All right. Professor, thank you so much for taking our call this morning. That is Professor Ian Sand who's the Director of Clinical HIV Research Unit at Wits University. Now, of course, the most important thing is for you to get tested, to know your status, because the sooner you know, the sooner you can take action. Right now, time for us to take a look at the news headlines with Zoe.